Welcome to a Queer Circle podcast. I'm your host, Billy James. I want to share a little bit about the podcast since this is our first episode. This is a queer circle, and so we're asking queer healers within the community to step up to the mic and share their story. We start off with the early days of their childhood and all the way to where they are now. I'm especially interested in what they have to share with their younger selves about navigating their healing journey. Our first guest tonight is Raymond Johnson. Raymond is a queer, trans Southerner. His education is in environmental science from Northwestern, a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Antioch, Los Angeles, and he's a graduate of Zen Shiatsu Chicago and a licensed Shiatsu practitioner. Currently, he's a Shiatsu therapist, a writer, a sound producer, and keyboardist. You may also recognize him from the podcast that we did together, Healing with Raymond and Billy. And all the music actually from this episode and future ones are from his band, Purple Fluorite. I'm excited to introduce Raymond to share his story with us.
Ambitious in a wider sense. That is, if he turns out to be a good guy. But I don't even know.
Actually, we'll start with the day negative of when I was conceived. No. I think I mentioned that. So I learned as a young adult, my mom told me that I was an accident. Her pregnancy was not planned per se. I'm the second child, so I guess they had my older brother and they weren't necessarily looking to have a second kid per se, but then my mom got pregnant. And she told me this, when she told me this, it was actually told in a really loving and beautiful way. It was just sort of like, you were the best surprise I could have ever imagined. You know, it was in a very sweet way. But sometimes when I tell the story, like if I don't set it up, it feels a little bit weird. Like, my mom told me that I wasn't planned. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, how do you feel about that? You know, and I feel fine about it. I feel like it makes a lot of sense. I think there's a lot of ways that I am a surprise and sort of different from my family, even though I also can, the more that I get to know my history and my ancestors, I also see exactly sort of where I came from. And I think I told you the story that I'd heard that there's sort of this a version of a creation myth which says, you know, to be born on this planet, you have to have your spirit who wants to have a life here. So just like there's a spirit in me that originated out in the universe and said, hey, I want to take a turn doing a life on that planet. So you need that energetic spirit. You need the two parents or the two genetic, you know, donors who decide we're going to put our DNA in with the spirit to make it happen. And then you also need to have a deity, a god or goddess on the planet that sponsors you, that sort of sponsors your arrival on this planet. And so I was raised in a Southern United Methodist home. So for most of my childhood, I was very active in church. I was very Methodist identified, Christian identified, very monotheistic God sort of identified. I always had sort of a very kind of liberal bend and angle on him, but still very like even saying him in that sense, like really had this conception of like God the Father and whatnot. And I've been thinking recently about how that was so important to me, that the structure and the community and the spirituality. And then when I went to college, it fell away pretty quickly. And not so much the spiritual practice, like I was still interested in thinking and talking and praying, and it started to move a little bit more into meditating versus praying at that point. But I very quickly realized that the community of Christians on my college campus was very different from the community of my church growing up, and that I was maybe more into the community of people than I was the Methodism per se, right? I mean, you know, like I was able to make peace with Methodism because the love of the activities and the things that I did. And our church was sort of a big community space center. Like, it had theater, and there was, sports, and I sang in the choir and things like that. So a lot of my artistic experience came from my church community as well. So it was all very tied up together. I always did, sang in the choir, did Sunday school, did volunteer stuff, I did youth group. It was very much sort of a community and a spiritual home for much of my upbringing. And I don't really know now, so going back to that story about, I feel like now I'm on the market to try and figure out who is my sponsoring deity. Like, who is the god or goddess that decided, yeah, okay, I'll be responsible for that sprite that wants to come down here or whatever, So I feel like that might be is a little bit, it's just something I've been ruminating on for a few years, because I feel a little bit like the answer is going to come to me. Like, I don't want to, I think at one point I maybe would sit down and be like, is there an encyclopedia of gods and goddesses? Maybe I'll peruse and see which one jumps out at me. But I kind of feel like, I think it's going to be a little bit more mysterious and organic, I should say. So I don't have, so that part of that origin, story I've been thinking about a lot, especially as far as because I've moved back to a small town in the South that's very Christian, that's very culturally Christian. So I'm surrounded by a lot of things that I grew up with and that were once familiar to me, but have kind of gotten defamiliarized over the years. And my partner, my wife, she grew up in New England, very not religious at all. So many times she just has these sort of cultural things like, what does that mean? So it's interesting to have some sort of translation moments, being back in the South. But she also grew up in smaller towns, whereas I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta. So there are also definitely some sort of small town cultural moments that she also kind of does translations as well. So it's been interesting to kind of be on this adventure with her in this part of my life, thinking about some of those origins and those going back. My parents are from southern Mississippi, and they both are from the same small town, Hattiesburg. For a long time, I never actually lived in Mississippi, but I spent a lot of time there as a kid. I'd go there for summers or holidays and things like that. So I have a lot of really fond memories and a lot of experiences from being there, especially from probably up to age 18. When I went away to college, I moved up to Chicago, and then after going to college, and I decided to stay there in my 20s, and that's when I came out. I came out in college as queer. I started to build a queer community. After college is when I decided, actually, I'm not a butch dyke. I want to transition, and I'm trans-identified. And so in 2000, is when I first went to a therapist, because back then you had to sort of, there was this whole thing called the Harry Benjamin standards of care and whatnot, which were these kind of weird protocols that doctors would sort of kind of follow in order if you wanted to medical transition. So there's basically all these kind of hoops and things you kind of had to jump through. And so I found a therapist, and I was extremely online very early, so it's definitely on the internet. Even then, I found some little rainbow LGBT therapist list that had 12 people on it, and this one woman, I was like, ooh, she does art therapy, I want her. And so I started to go see her, and she's amazing. Shout out to my very first therapist. I went to see at the end of my very first session. So at the time, a lot of times the recommended thing was that therapists, you had to see therapists for a certain number of sessions, between 3 to 6 sessions, and then they give you a letter, et cetera, et cetera. So after the first session, she basically said, well, I'll write you a letter anytime, that's fine, but we need to talk about your family. So she was like, your gender's fine, I don't need to sign off on your gender, but I'm not ready to sign off on your dynamic with your parents. So I was luckily I had her sort of during that period to walk me through, because it is a really stressful time period to be coming out to everyone and having to do all that sort of education. And it's hard on a trans person now. It's hard on a trans person now. I don't want to I don't want to discount that it's like easy, but the environment 20 years ago was such that I think there's probably always going to be repetitive conversations that happen when you're coming out. Like, you're going to be kind of telling this sort of same story about yourself, like, sort of over and over again. I think that's just a little bit of human nature. It's a little bit of this. But in certain categories, and when you're in a certain group, like especially marginalized groups, and there's always the power imbalance, and there's just the sheer repetition of it, it just becomes very taxing. So I think what I'm sort of like dancing around the thing before I started to talk about the thing, but transitioning 20 years ago, I had a really amazing group of people who were all like, they all wanted to get it, and a lot of people worked really hard to get it, and I'm very grateful. Like, so many of those people are still friends of mine today. They're still in my queer family, and I love them. But there are also people that maybe said weird, terrible, icky things, and I just kind of never talked to them again. Or there was just people, or just a lot of, it just was a lot of work. It was a lot of effort. And at the time, it was like the price you paid in order to live in the body you wanted. Like, I was like, this is what I got to do, is I have to fucking sit down. Can you swear on your show? I'm sorry. I'll redo that with a non-swearing version. Just because it's your show for the kids. Anyway, so as I was saying, it was a lot of conversations. There was a lot of sort of, I think I was saying is that I felt like it was the price to pay to live in the body I wanted. And I was happy to pay it, because that's what I wanted. I wanted to live in this body I wanted. And I never felt, I kind of identify as a non-binary trans man, or I just identify sometimes as queer trans, just because I feel like my sexuality is queer, my gender is kind of queer. I tend to be attracted to queer people. Like, I tend to be attracted to queer men and queer women, like, so it's not so much about I'm attracted to all women or all men or all non-binary people or all femmes or anything like that. Like, it tends to be a little bit, a little bit more blurry, I guess, which is what I've always sort of liked, is that not having the rigidity of categories. Because I was often, like, I felt like my gender stuff as a kid was very rarely about how I felt about my body. So when I came out as trans, so when I'm talking about 2003, I was actually turning 23 that year. So I waited till I was after college, because I kind of was scared that my parents might pull support for me. So they supported me through college. They helped me through college. I went to school. I did work, but they did, pay for a lot of that. And I was just kind of like, I don't think they would do that. Like, it was nothing they had ever threatened. It didn't really totally seem like their style, but also you just never know. You never know how people are going to respond. So I kind of waited, and I think I also had this idea of, like, I wanted to kind of be like a year kind of out on my own and figure it out. And I don't know, it was just sort of an arbitrary thing I gave myself, I guess when you're surrounded by a lot of, like, gatekeeping messages, like, is this real? Are you sure? Are you sure that you're trans? Are you positive you're trans? And I was like, I just don't think that non-trans people spend, like, hours and hours and hours a day reading trans stories and trans message boards and Yahoo groups and all that stuff that I was kind of doing to really, like, take it in. I had sort of a sweet and tender full circle moment. My birthday was recently, and I decided to, I've kind of been pulling back a lot on social media, just because it's so embarrassing to say, but it gives me anxiety. And I think the reason it's embarrassing to say is because, like I said, I've been on the internet for over 20 years. Like, I've been extremely online for a very long time. So it's kind of strange to suddenly have lost your capacity to kind of do something or to take something that for a long time you've just been, like, I've been in that space. I've been in that space of media. And I see it, and I know what to do, and it's not that it doesn't affect me, but I just was always able to manage it. And at some point I had to sort of admit, like, I'm not managing it well, and I do think that a shift has sort of happened in the last couple of years as far as, like, really ramping up advertising and the way that it's always the algorithm and all that stuff trying to pull it in or whatever. So I'm trying to kind of renegotiate my relationship with that, while also like I love the internet and I have friends on the internet. I love connecting with community. I live in a small town, like I said, 10,000 people. There's not a lot of trans people here. There's not a lot of queer people here. I need to be online to see my friends and see my community. But I also need to just really kind of make sure I'm doing that in kind of conscientious ways that are feeding me, and making sure that my feeds are like 80% joy and only 20% death, and not the other way around, you know. So going back to the Facebook thing, I decided I almost was going to take my birthday just off of my Facebook profile. I was just all like, I don't want any attention for my birthday. Just everything goes to the movement. Just take care of COVID and take care of police brutality, and I don't want any attention for my birthday. And then I was all like, okay, Raymond, I don't think it works that way. Maybe you could just not like just don't visit the page that day if you're not feeling it or whatever. And so I ended up like the next day, it was kind of nice, like the day after my birthday, to like sit and kind of to read all these really lovely messages, because I have gorgeous and beautiful friends and family on my Facebook who leave me these really loving messages. So I'm glad I let myself receive it. But it's always funny to me what random people always will wish you happy birthday, and you maybe aren't that close to them, right? Like you're always like, oh, that's like, it's sweet, but I'm also like, huh, right? So, but one of the people that at first I didn't recognize the name, I was like, who's this person? And then I clicked on it and I realized it was someone from one of the FTM trans groups that I'm in. So I'm in a couple groups for like trans guys, trans men, especially ones that are geared towards those of us who have been on hormones for like 10, 15, 20 years, things like that. Just, it's kind of nice just to be able to like talk about medical things, or just how our bodies are shifting and whatnot, and aging and things like that. But so he was from one of those groups, and that actually, his name is Andy. I'm going to just say that. I think that's fine. But he had this webpage called Andy's Passing Tips, which, you know, I know this is sort of dated language, but it was this whole sort of like, it was a very sort of simple HTML website of just like, it was almost all just text, just white with black text, like no images, things like that. But it was essentially like a guide for like, here's what men traditionally do, and if you want to sort of masculize your appearance and help your, you know, pass as a man more, here are kind of things to look for. And I know that's like, there's kind of that's very strange language. It feels strange coming out of my mouth now, because that's so not how I am now. Like whenever anyone's talking about like real men do this or real women do this, I'm just like, oh God, resist all binaries, you know, things like that. But again, please keep in mind that this was like over 20 years ago, and that is there are a group of trans men that like, they feel like I am a man. Like they feel very strong internally that I am a man, and it really hurts me, physically hurts me, that my outside body does not look like how it looks like in my head. I didn't really have that exact experience. But I definitely was not in my body. Like, I think I just was super pragmatic. I think I was just a little bit like, I don't really know. Everyone's talking to me weird about my body and giving me strange attention as a young girl's body. Like, literally the first time I remember having a creepy dude say something to me, I was 5 years old. That shit is fucked. Like, it's deep, it is wide, and it's an ocean that we are just starting to like kind of dip into the surface of, as far as like of the intensity of like misogyny and patriarchy and sort of all of that's kind of comes out. So I've always been in this sort of way where I've never felt like connected to my female body per se, or any sort of idea of femininity and masculinity, as it was just given to me in the suburbs of Atlanta in the 80s and 90s by some, you know, Southern Christian, you know, folks or whatever. Once I kind of got out in the world and I saw that there was different ways of living, I started to see my sort of feelings and my ideas about the world reflected in other people, and that sort of connection of familiarity within queer and trans people. I was definitely always like I was an overachiever as a kid and as a teenager, and I think I've always felt kind of like I didn't connect with most anyone. So in some ways, like, gender was the least of it, or not the least of it, but it was just one of many things that I didn't necessarily feel like I didn't always sort of get why other people did the things that they did, or why things happened the way they did. But I've always been very interested in that sort of how things work way of looking at the world. I've always been sort of a naturalist and interested in biological and nature and figuring things out. And that even applies to human beings. And so I think I'm very much was, it was about sort of what I was seeing and what I was experiencing. So it wasn't like I saw it on TV, so it must be real. But I mean, like everything I took in, I was watching things on TV, but I was looking out the window. I was listening to how the adults talked. I was watching around. I was always like closely paying attention. And I think that's a little bit my skill set, and that's my nature of who I am, is being able to pay attention to the full environment and knowing what little parts to kind of focus in. I do think that that's probably also tied up into my experience of being different. So even if I didn't necessarily know, like I didn't even really know that I was different. Even though it's so fun, I think about this so often recently, because like I've been going in the past few years, I've had a lot of sort of like unofficial diagnoses or pre-diagnosis. Like someone would diagnose me but say, go get tested, like about all these different things. So PTSD actually kind of came first. So when I started to look at unhealed trauma as sort of uncovering for like depression and anxiety I was experiencing in my 20s and 30s, that I realized I was like, okay, I'm going to start digging towards that sort of route. And when I was learning about PTSD is when I started to learn about executive function, which was something that I was also dealing with and struggles with my brain, which that then led me to like ADHD. And I was like, oh my gosh, those are my people. Like, and that's my family. Like I could see it, all this stuff. When you're in those spaces, and when you're in those spaces nowadays, there's a lot of overlap with just neurodivergence in general. And in more recent sort of research that I've been doing, I've had a moment where I was like, someone suggested, hey, have you ever been tested for autism? And I was like, no, son of a biscuit. And it's just one of those things where like you're studying something and you're like, wait, no, me? No, wait, huh? And so like, I still don't like, so I think it's one of those things where and I've had this story for a while. The reason why I kind of bring up these kind of Western diagnoses is because they also kind of fit into sort of these other sort of stories that I carry with me. So if you look at my story through like an astrology lens, I am a Cancer with an Aries rising. So I have this sort of the sensitive, gooey inside, the sensitive poet who has all this sense of home and family and taking care of things. But I have this outer persona, this fiery, confident, stubborn, beautiful Aries, like fire, like sort of sign on my outside. I think a lot of people can see that. Like they see me as someone who is an animated storyteller, who teaches workshops, who's tells a lot of like funny joke. Well, I contend I've never told a joke in my life. I think that I just really feel like I'm very literal. I think I'm extremely literal, but I find realism funny. So I just say something, and then that makes me laugh, so then people think it's a joke. But I was like, I'm just describing how things are. But, so, which goes back to this is why maybe people are suggesting that I might want to look into autism spectrum things. But because I had acting training, so I've been an actor for a very long time, and I think it was a survival technique. I also just think it's something I have. I have the ability to look at people, to pick up things, to emulate things, to copy, all that. So I have long had a very fuzzy sense of self in that way because I'm someone who learns by watching. And it's hard not to feel like you're a copycat. You get called being a copycat, or are you doing this just because your friend is doing it? And that's definitely something that I felt like I got called out for occasionally as a kid. And but and then you get older and you're like, that's just human. That's what we do as human beings. We just copy each other. Like, that's a very just sort of social skill in learning that and whatnot. And I also think it really hindered a lot of my creative life, or delayed it, I should say. I mean, I feel like I'm a very creative, artistic person now. But as I untangle my relationship to my process, I think about so much of art making is really just like, pick something that you like and make 1,000 of them. And the easiest thing to do is just pick something that someone else made and make 1,000 copies of it. And in that process of copying it is when you start to develop your voice. But no one really explained that process to me. So if no one told me that that's how art works, and really the main message I had was like, don't be a copycat, to be original, don't be, whatever. So for a long time, I had all this like really intense sort of stress on my writing and perfectionism and anything creative I wanted to do, because I just had a fundamental misunderstanding of the creative process and how it kind of worked. I also, I think I went to grad school too early. I went because it was I got my MFA, but then it wasn't until 5 years after I graduated that's I think I can call myself a writer now. But I kind of just, I had access and the ability to jump in and go. And, I had a manuscript and they were like, oh yeah, great. And I was like, okay, I'll be a writer. That sounds good. So I have I know, so young kids listening today, and Billy says, what advice do you want to give the young people? Don't get too much credit card debt. Don't collect too much student loans. Yeah, but it's also that's also life. I had amazing experiences. I met amazing people who are, part of my friends forever. We all have debts to pay in various ways, some of them more literal than others. But going back to the sort of the sense of self piece and the what it means, it's so I also laugh because I feel like my whole life my mom would sort of describe me as being a little bit special, and sometimes my dad would describe me as being a little bit sensitive, and now I'm like, oh, ADHD and autism. Is that what you meant? That's what you meant. But because I get, I was one of those kids, I got good grades and I did everything right and I followed the rules, but no one ever stopped to ask me if I was okay. And I kind of very rarely was. I was always just very kind of tightly wound and nervous and hypervigilant in a way, So for me now as an adult, going back, I think for a while, for a while I see things as my special skill, because that's a way to kind of empower myself and to rewrite the story. But sometimes I would go too fast to those stories and I wouldn't feel the pain. And that's kind of the piece that I've been doing a lot with myself now. The work I'm doing now is not so much about the pain in my microcosm life, because I have, I'm very safe right now. I have a very wonderful, safe home life. I have food. I'm not sick. All of those things. And it's provided me now this opportunity for my body to kind of freak out and feel all these feelings that we've been putting in a drawer, for the first few decades of my life. So some of that stuff I was alluding to in the beginning, some of those, coming out as a trans person 20 years ago and often being the only trans person in the room, or the first trans person that a lot of people knew. And even though I feel pretty lucky that I didn't have too many negative experiences, still just having to kind of walk through that. I'm grateful for the few sort of older queer elders I had that were kind of around me, because I felt like they got it a little bit in a different way. So I was often would be pleasantly surprised that me as a 23-year-old kind of butch dyke turns trans guy would be, at a party with dykes in their 40s and 50s, who maybe didn't know, they didn't make the same decision that I did and didn't exactly and they didn't want to make it for themselves, but they understood having to walk through the world and answer those questions and have those conversations at such a young age. So I feel really happy for that. And so I feel like whenever I can be in space with younger queer people, I'm always thinking about like what did the mentors offer me? Like what were those kind of like random things that really kind of stayed with me, and how can I sort of like give it back to them in that sense? Because I never want to be like, I don't want to be one of those people that's like, I had it so hard and you kids don't know. Like that is not what I mean at all. Like by any stretch of the imagination. Like I want it to keep getting easier and easier for queer and trans kids to live and be in this world, because we still have so much room to grow as far as like making this just a space for them to feel like they can survive and they can thrive here. Something kind of happened to me, I think. I mean, there've been different stages that I've been radicalized in different ways around different issues and at different levels. And when 4 years ago in 2016, this is before the election, but when the Pulse massacre happened, there was something that happened to me that's unlocked a lot of anger. I realized that I had a lot of anger and a lot of rage from stuff in my 20s and early 30s, but it was interesting because it also was kind of a new sense of like energy. Like I was like, oh, I am going to stay alive out of spite because I'm going to tell everyone what you did here. Everyone, I'm going to live another 50 years because I am not letting the record show. Like I was there and I heard y'all and I saw your dumb comments and I know what you thought. So don't be afraid of queer spite. I mean, love and light and queer spite.
If he turns out to be a good guy, but I don't even know.
Love and light and queer spite. I would talk to my younger self to trust my brain more and to acknowledge that I need to get to know it and get to know how to use it, but that is different than it being like wrong or bad. I think that there was a lot of messages I've internalized around being a certain way and fitting in a certain way. I think I was also definitely, I was raised in a military. My father was in the military, so a military household, and so there was a lot of following orders and a lot of really intense strictness and a lot of really intense respect for authority. But that, and so what I kind of learned, I did learn how to, it's good to learn how to follow the rules, because in some situations, knowing how to follow the rules is a useful tool. But I think understanding what I was doing as a useful tool and not taking it so like personally, because there was a lot of things I think it played into my perfectionism and to my sense of self. I think a lot about that, like the sort of unconscious messaging I got as a kid was that, we're worthy through the grace of God. And if you're a good person and follow the rules, then good things will happen. Okay. I feel like those are like the two things that were kind of taught to me, which superficially seemed fine, but the messaging kind of became that I was inherently not worthy, and that if you follow a certain sequence, you're owed something. Like that's kind of what unconsciously I think got planted. So I feel like what I've had to sort of, as I've gone out in the world and expanded my understanding and seen how life works, I kind of feel like I have to switch it and be the total opposite, which is that like I am beautiful and I deserve everything. I deserve everything, but the world doesn't owe me shit. So like it doesn't matter. You can follow every rule. You can do all these things that they tell you, but it's not going to work out for you. It's not going to work out for everyone, all this stuff or whatever. And so I think really that that seemed really scary to do both. Like I wanted to just be like, can I just do the first one, which is that I'm beautiful and worthy, and also if I continue to be a good person and follow the rules, then all good things will happen to me. Like, can I just do those two things? And you can't, because at the end of the day, like, don't get me wrong, the world has so many amazing things to like available to us that are just right there, just if we're able to be in that space. Um, but there's not that sort of a ledger. There's not an owing in that sense, no matter how perfect and how good you perform to be. I think that was a lot of the things that kind of happened in my coming out to my parents, is that I think I always was like, I tried to be the best girl that I could be, and it didn't work, so I'm trans. And I think they were a little bit like, wait, what? This is the first time we're hearing this. Whereas for me, from my point of view, I was all like, you saw me try everything, and you know I'm good at this, and so if I couldn't make it work, then come on, like, trust me. Trust me, I did the legwork. I figured it out. So I tried to do get the research done. So, but like, I also, I hope everyone, I'm saying this with a lot of generosity, because we were all doing the best we can, and I feel very lucky that my parents are in my life right now, and it took a lot of years of kind of getting to know each other, who we are now, and so a lot of this work is just really more about like me and my own, like, working through my past selves, and it doesn't have that sort of active pain or active heat that certain wounds did in my 20s. Like, in my 20s, I was mostly estranged from them. And I think I sort of, I underestimated how, some of the wounds and some of the pain of that, how it affected me. And it's only been in kind of the past like 5 or 6 years that I've been able to kind of like peel back and actually kind of address that. I actually just, for my birthday, one of the books I ordered was Janet Mock's second memoir, Surpassing Certainty, because I realized I hadn't read it. I had read her first one, which is more about her teenage years, but then I totally kind of missed that she had a memoir about her 20s, and I was like, oh, this is perfect. I can work through my 20s work and read about her 20s. I also have, like, I was on LiveJournal back in the day, in like 2000, 2001. So earlier this year, I was doing some memoir writing work and research, and I was digging through some of those journals from that time. And it's kind of wild to see, like, some of the ways I talk sound very like, oh, I totally sound like I'm in my early 20s. Like, there's just sort of a certain kind of like confidence and sarcasm, and just there's something about it that I was like, oh yeah, that version of me, but it was also funny to see like some of the stuff I talked about or was struggling with is like the exact same stuff I struggle with now. Just as far as like dealing with my brain or dealing with people or dealing with energy, all that stuff, just slightly different language. So this is so silly, but this one thing that Betty White I said like years ago, but I think about it all the time, is that like what they don't tell you about aging is that like you kind of really don't change on the inside. Like, there's ways that obviously like we learn things and we grow and things shift, but like our sense of self, I feel like doesn't totally change, like, yeah. And how we carry ourselves as a lens, and like how we take things in, and then what we put out, like that. There's something that's very like, that's our essence,
Raymond, thank you so much for joining us today. If you're interested in contacting Raymond for more information or any kind of question, you can contact him through his website, mountainzenshiatsu.com. Also, purplefluorite.bandcamp.com. That information will also be posted to our podcast website, queercirclepodcast.com. Today's music was provided to us by Raymond Johnson, Purple Fluorite, available wherever there's streaming. iTunes, Spotify, and more.